For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 347, the Responsible Disposal Reauthorization Act of 2019.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 347, a bill to extend the authorization of the Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act of 1978 relating to the disposal site in Mesa County, Colorado.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, and the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days by which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 347.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last September, the House approved an identical bill, H.R. 2278, in the 115th Congress by a voice vote. Unfortunately, that bill did not move in the Senate, so we are back to reconsider H.R. 347, introduced by Mr. Tipton and co-sponsored by my Energy and Commerce colleague, Ms. DeGette. The Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act established a process for remediating inactive uranium ore processing sites, such as the one in Grand Junction, Colorado. To protect public health and safety from potential risks, uranium mill tailings must be disposed at a site that is licensed and that meets standards established by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Environmental Protection Agency. The continued operation of the Cheney disposal cell is critical. Last year, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment provided the following for the record, and I quote, "Given that this is the only DOE uranium mill tailings disposal site left in the country, it is critical that this facility remains open to receive and dispose of the uranium mill tailings that are discovered in our communities. This action will ensure the continued protection of human health and the environment," and I close quote. The cell receives approximately 2,700 cubic yards of additional waste per year and has sufficient space to receive an estimated 235,000 cubic yards, which represents 86 more years of operation at current rates. H.R. 347 would authorize the Department of Energy to continue to operate the Cheney disposal cell through September 2048 or until it is filled to capacity. Currently, DOE is authorized to operate this cell through September of 2023. Mr. Speaker, this is a good bipartisan bill, and I do hope we can move it forward today. And with that, I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserved. Without objection, the gentleman from Illinois will control the time for the majority. Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first, with the apologies to our official reporter and directed at you, laissez les bon temps rouler.
Today
Mr.
is
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 347, the Responsible Disposal Reauthorization Act of 2019, was introduced by our Colorado colleague, Scott Tipton, and co-sponsored by my Energy and Commerce Committee colleague from Colorado, Diana DeGette. H.R. 347 extends the authorization of the Uranium Mill Tailing Radiation Control Act of 1978 site in Mesa County, Colorado. The legislation was passed by the House last September, and the bill today is identical to what we passed last year, save a change in dates. The legislation was considered by the Subcommittee on Environment and marked up through regular order. It was reported by the full committee with a bipartisan amendment by a voice vote. Mining and processing of uranium generates a byproduct known as uranium mill tailings. Congress passed the Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act 40 years ago to establish a framework for DOE to dispose of mill tailings, which are left over from nuclear defense activities and from development of our commercial nuclear industry. The act also authorized the Grand Junction, Colorado site to serve as a disposal location. This is the only DOE uranium mill tailings disposal site remaining open in the nation, and so it is necessary for the final disposition of mill tailings discovered in communities. H.R. 347 extends the site's current authorization until 2031. The extension will enable the site to plan long-term operations to protect public health and the Environment. I urge passage of this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have no additional speakers on our side, and I'll continue to reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as he may consume. The author of the legislation, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for as much time as he may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank my colleague from Illinois for the time. And Mr. Speaker, the Department of Energy's Cheney disposal cell in Mesa County, Colorado, is a critical component of the DOE Legacy Management's mission to protect public health and the environment. The cell receives radioactive waste materials that were produced decades ago during the uranium melting process. The waste materials continue to be uncovered during road construction, bill replacement, home foundation excavations, and other construction activities in several towns in western Colorado. Once the waste materials are discovered, they must be properly disposed of at the Cheney cell. The authorization for the Cheney disposal cell expires at the end of 2023 or when the site is filled to capacity. Currently, the remaining capacity in the cell is approximately 234,000 cubic yards, and therefore an extended authorization is required. H.R. 347 would extend the authorization until 2031. As my colleague from Illinois noted, we passed this legislation in the last Congress, but this bill is now coming up at a critically important time. According to the Department of Energy, if the disposal cell is not reauthorized this year, DOE will have to take steps to begin to decommission the site. This means no more materials will be accepted in 2019, and we will lose a critical component of the DOE's legacy management program. I'd like to thank my colleague from Colorado, Ms. Diana DeGette, for her support on this bill, and for leadership on the Energy and Commerce Committee for recognizing the need to bring this bill up now. Urge my colleagues to support H.R. 347, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have no additional speakers, and I'll continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I urge passage of the bill, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, for the reasons that this legislation would allow for the only of its kind in the country, it's important that we pass this important infrastructure concept, and I encourage our colleagues to support the bill. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 347? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1138 to reauthorize the West Valley Demonstration Project.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1138, a bill to reauthorize the West Valley Demonstration Project and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days by which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 1138.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last September, the House approved an identical bill, H.R. 2389, in the 115th Congress by a voice vote. Unfortunately, that bill did not move in the Senate. Today, we will reconsider H.R. 1138, which has been reintroduced by my New York colleague and friend, Mr. Reed. The Western New York Service Center in West Valley, New York, has been the center of disputes and legislative actions since the 1980s. This site is a difficult reminder that we are still dealing with the consequences of our nation's entry into the atomic age. While the site is owned by New York State, between 1966 and 1972, it was operated by a private business to reprocess spent nuclear fuel primarily provided by the federal government. Those reprocessing activities ended decades ago, but high-level waste and transuranic waste continue to be stored at the site. A cost-sharing agreement for the site's remediation has been resolved, but disposal of the waste remains a point of contention. Since 1986, DOE has classified the wastes as commercial rather than waste deriving from atomic energy defense activities. Under this classification, DOE believes that the cost for disposal of the waste should be borne by the state of New York. New York State believes that since 60% of the material sent to West Valley was from facilities that conducted defense activities, and 80% of the reprocessed plutonium shipped out of West Valley was sent to defense facilities, it should be categorized as defense-related waste. This classification disagreement has major consequences for how the waste can be disposed of and who will be responsible for covering the costs. While I would prefer more certainty in clarifying the waste classification, this legislation puts us on a path towards solving this issue by requiring a GAO report on the origins of and disposal pathways, including cost estimates. In addition, the bill reauthorizes the West Valley demonstration project at $75 million annually for 7 years. This funding level is in line with historic appropriations levels and will ensure the cleanup will continue on schedule. This bill may not resolve the decades-old dispute between New York and the Department of Energy. It does address funding for the remediation of the site and attempts to move the ball forward to ensure that wastes are disposed of properly and, most importantly, fairly. With that, I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recognize myself for as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 1138 is a bill to reauthorize the West Valley demonstration project. It was introduced recently by our New York colleague, Tom Reed. I also see my good friend Brian Higgins on the floor, and I know the chairman has been personally involved with this for many, many, many years. The House passed an essentially identical version of this bill this past September on suspension. Prior to that vote, the bipartisan legislation that had moved through the Energy and Commerce Committee by regular order, including legislative hearing and markups as part of our broader nuclear waste management agenda. It was reported by the full committee with bipartisan amendment by voice vote. H.R. 1138 authorizes appropriations to support the Department of Energy's environmental remediation at its West Valley cleanup site in New York through 2026. It also directs a study to help Congress determine the final disposition of radioactive waste that DOE is cleaning up at the site. 1138 continues the work of Congress to address the federal government's obligations for treatment and disposal of the legacy waste produced during the Cold War and through the federal government's early efforts to develop a civilian nuclear energy industry. The Department of Energy has successfully remediated 92 sites of this waste, but the most technologically challenging projects remain in process at 17 locations, one of which is the West Valley site. In 1980, Congress passed the West Valley Demonstration Project Act to direct DOE to address legacy environmental issues and authorize appropriations only through fiscal year 1981. The project has not been reauthorized since that time, despite Congress's funding DOE's work at the site for the past 37 years. H.R. 1138 corrects the situation, provides a path to answering important questions concerning the waste disposition, and ensures spending at the site is subject to an active authorization. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 1138 and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would like to now yield to my colleague and friend, the gentleman from New York's 26th Congressional District, Representative Higgins, for as much time as he may consume.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of Congressman Tom Reed's House Bill 1138, which authorizes funding for the cleanup of the West Valley Demonstration Project, a nuclear waste remediation site in Western New York. Mr. Speaker, advocates are in Washington this week to remind Congress of the importance of the Great Lakes as a source of clean water for millions of Americans. The long-term cleanup at West Valley, which sits 30 miles from Lake Erie and at the foot of a tributary stream, will prevent harmful contamination to the region. The Department of Energy has an obligation to ensure that 600,000 gallons of high-level radioactive waste are solidified and disposed of safely and expeditiously. The funding in this bill will allow us to do just that. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask that Mr. Reed from New York, the author of the legislation, be recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Shimkus, for yielding me the time and your leadership on this issue, as well as my good friends, Paul Tonko and Brian Higgins, for joining me in the effort today in regards to the West Valley Reauthorization Act before us. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this legislation. This legislation deals with a project located in our district in Western New York in the great community of West Valley. West Valley, New York is the home of radioactive waste that has been distributed there and deposited there over the years way back when. But I will tell you, over the last 15 years, this site has led the nation, in my humble opinion, in coming up with techniques and technologies that are deployed across other nuclear waste facilities and sites in order to handle that high-level radioactive waste from those facilities as well as those in West Valley. Mr. Speaker, I think it is only right to bring further clarity and certainty to our area of the district at West Valley in regards to this bill, given 7 years worth of reauthorization legislation, to send the signal that not only do we stand and support the appropriations that go to this facility in order to clean it up in the most efficient and effective manner, but also we stand as authorizers to say that this type of facility and this type of program needs to be renewed for at least 7 years. Because, Mr. Speaker, it is going to take many more years to clean this site up. Giving this site 7 years of that certainty, additional certainty, is only the right thing to do in order to have these folks that are doing the hard work, given the indications from Congress that we stand with them as they engage in this effort. So as I close, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the entire Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Shimkus for his tireless work on the issue of nuclear waste cleanup and standing with us on this piece of legislation. In particular, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the local officials, the Town of Ashford Supervisor Charles Davis, the West Valley Deputy General Manager Scott Anderson, and the other local leaders that have stood in concert in a community effort in order to bring this West Valley demonstration site to a complete closure, hopefully in the near future, with the legislation that we have before us. So I ask my colleagues to join in support of this legislation and truly appreciate their efforts to join us today. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have no additional speakers on our side, and I'll continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 1138, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Illinois yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. West Valley as an issue has been there for a long time. It is good to know that we're moving the ball forward. I encourage our colleagues to support this measure and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1138? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 1381.
Without objection.
I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1381, Burn Pits Registry Enhancement Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1381, a bill to direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to take actions necessary to ensure that certain individuals may update the burn pit registry with a registered individual's cause of death and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano, and the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rowe, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too, in celebration of today, say, laissez le bon temps rouler. I yield myself such time as they may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in strong support of H.R. 1381. During operations and enduring freedom and Iraqi freedom, and in other parts of the world where American service members were deployed, the Department of Defense exposed brave Americans to toxic fumes and dangerous chemicals by burning waste in open-air burn pits. Some of the waste burned in these open-air pits were human waste, styrofoam, lithium batteries, tires, medical waste, and other toxic substances. Service members had no way to avoid inhaling the smoke from these burn pits that were located on their bases, sometimes right next to their barracks. When this committee held a hearing last year on burn pits, we heard from Leroy Torres, a founder of Burn Pits 360, who breathed in burn pit smoke while stationed in Bulaud Air Base in Iraq 2007. When he returned home in 2008, he needed immediate hospitalization for lung disease. Mr. Torres and other veterans suffering from medical conditions believed to be caused by exposure to burn pits are still fighting to receive health care and benefits because illnesses potentially caused by burn pit exposure still aren't recognized by VA. Research to understand the harmful effects these toxic substances may have had on military service members is now underway. However, the totality of harmful health effects this dangerous practice may have had on service members is yet to be fully known and understood, and it may take years for clinicians and scientists to understand the health effects or discover effective treatments for those who were exposed. In an effort to better track the health effects these exposures had on deployed troops, Congress required VA to create the Open Burn Pit Registry in 2012 to compile self-reported data on veterans who believe they were exposed to open-air burn pits while serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. This registry allows VA to easily communicate with this population of veterans as well as track trends within the population that may indicate a need for further research into certain health concerns. However, the registry failed to provide in it the ability to report cause of death for veterans who are registered and then subsequently pass away. Congressman Ruiz's bill, the Burn Pit Registry Enhancement Act, would allow an individual designated by the veteran during the registry process or an immediate family member to update the veteran's file on the registry with a cause of death. These additional data will allow researchers and VA to identify trends, similarities, and correlations in this population that will better inform research efforts on the impact these open-air burn pits have on the service members who served in combat zones. With the addition of more data to the Burn Pits Registry, we hope this will help VA conduct groundbreaking research that will lead to prevention and treatments for toxic exposures, including exposure to toxic substances inescapably connected to military service. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 1381, the Burn Pit Registry Enhancement Act. This bill is sponsored by Dr. Raul Ruiz of California and Dr. Brad Winstrup of Ohio. Both Dr. Ruiz and Dr. Winstrup are medical professionals, former members of the Committee on Veterans Affairs, and co-chairs of the House Burn Pit Caucus. I'm grateful to them both for their efforts with respect to this legislation, for their continued dedication to serving our nation's veterans on a bipartisan basis. The response to growing fears about the long-term health effects of burn pit exposure, Congress required the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, to create the Airborne Hazards and Open Burn Pit Registry, the registry, in 2013. The registry was intended to provide a forum for service members and veterans to document the toxic exposures they experienced in service to our country and report health issues they believe may be connected to those exposures to VA to assist in research regarding toxic exposure impacts and treatments. While the registry continues to be an important tool for those worried about burn pits and other toxic or environmental exposures, advocates have expressed concern over the years that the registry is not being used to its greatest potential. During a hearing before the Subcommittee on Health last June, two important stakeholder groups, Burn Pits 360 and the Veterans of Foreign War of the United States, or VFW, recommended that the registry be improved by allowing family members to update the registry in the event of the death of a service member or veteran listed on it. Accordingly, the Burn Pit Registry Enhancement Act would, upon the death of a service member or a veteran listed in the registry, allow an immediate family member or other designated individual to report that service member or veteran's death to the registry and list his or her cause of death in the registry. According to Burn Pits 360, without tracking the mortality rate through methods such as allowing a surviving family member to report deaths and the cause of death, the registry's ability to establish mortality rates related to conditions and diseases associated with toxic exposure will be precluded. I agree, which is why I'm pleased to support this bill today. That said, I do regret that it did not move through regular order. Had it been subject to a committee hearing and markup, it surely would have benefited from a robust debate and discussion by committee members, by VA, and by veteran service organizations and other interested parties, and perhaps made even stronger. I look forward to continued committee work on this important subject. With that, I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the comments from my colleague, the ranking member, about regular order. I can assure you we will discuss this subject further, and I appreciate and take to heart his comments. At this time, I would like to yield 5 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from California, and the author of this bill, Mr. Ruiz.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, and also thank you for your staff with all your work on this. They've done a great job. Thank you for fighting for this bill and for your tireless work in support of our veterans. Thank you, Ranking Member Dr. Phil Rowe, for your support of our veterans who have been exposed to burn pits. And a special shout out to my good friend, Dr. Congressman Brad Wenstrup, who is the co-lead on this bill. We've worked together on this and numerous bills, and we're also leading the efforts in the bipartisan Burn Pits Caucus to really give answers to our veterans who have been exposed. My bill, the Burn Pit Registry Enhancement Act, will help our government better understand the health effects of toxic burn pits on our men and women in uniform. As a nation, we have a responsibility to provide our veterans with the benefits that they have earned and deserve, and to keep them safe to the best of our ability when they're in the field. We bear that responsibility even more heavily when the actions of our own government, in this case, its use of toxic burn pits, are causing veterans to develop severe pulmonary illnesses, cancers, autoimmune diseases, and chronic conditions that are making young, otherwise very healthy veterans extremely ill, permanently oxygen dependent, totally disabled, and in some cases, leading to their death. This is what happened to Jennifer Kepner, a constituent of mine, a mother of two young children, and a veteran of the United States Air Force. Despite being only 39 years of age, living an active lifestyle, very healthy, not having any other risk factors, Jennifer developed a very aggressive pancreatic cancer that ultimately took her life. Jennifer's oncologist conducted an extensive genetic and environmental risk assessment and found that the only probable and most probable cause of her cancer was her exposure to burn pits. These are acres, sometimes 10 acres big, of open burn pits where they burn everything and anything and light that garbage open burn pit with jet fuel that exposes our service members to hundreds of toxic chemicals and carcinogens and huge clouds of black smoke that traverse long distances. So while Jennifer was fighting bravely against her cancer, she also had to fight tooth and nail to get the health care and the benefits that she had earned. And even then, the VA did not recognize her cancer's connection to burn pit exposures. So I was there in her final days, and she wanted us to do something. She called it our generation's Agent Orange. She wanted us to do something to prevent and to help other veterans. So there's a principle I use as a doctor and a public health expert, and that's when there is a high enough suspicion of an agent that can cause a severe enough health consequence, then we have to act on that suspicion. And in this case, we do have enough suspicion, given the information that's out there, that burn pits are essentially toxic and causing health problems, and this effects are even death. So it's definitely severe enough. So we need to do something. There's 4 prongs that we need to pursue, 4 pillars of a framework. 1 is stop the use of burn pits. 2 is outreach to veterans and providers and educate them about their risks. 3 is to make sure that we take care of our veterans by providing health care and some of the benefits that they have earned. And also do more research so that we can fully understand the full effects, health effects of being exposed to these burn pits. So this bill and the burn pit registry will help with 2 of those fronts. 1 is that it is a vehicle for the VA and DOD and our government to communicate with veterans who have been exposed to burn pits and their family members about any recent health topics, research, or any policy change that they may be interested in. It also helps them grab samples of veterans for future research so that we can better understand with more robust research, scientific research, the full effects of burn pits in their life, which could lead to a better understanding, better healthcare, better outreach, and more benefits for our permanently disabled veterans. So it's very important that veterans who have been exposed to burn pits register into the burn pit registry and build this communication vehicle with the VA and our government and those of us who are strong advocates for our veterans. So my bill will allow a entry into the burn pit registry after a veteran passes away with the cause of death. For example, right now, if a veteran passes away, there's no way to update this burn pit registry with their cause of death. This allows a spouse or a designee to enter that cause of death. And those causes of death could be pancreatic cancer, brain cancer. 30 seconds more, please.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I yield an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for additional 30
These
seconds.
causes of death: brain cancer, esophageal cancer, pancreatic cancer, autoimmune diseases, lymphomas, leukemias, constrictive bronchiolitis, COPD, and others. So I urge every member of this chamber to support this bipartisan bill, which will help our nation uphold its commitment to serving our veterans. Together, we're taking a crucial first step toward honoring Jennifer Kepner and improving and saving the lives of countless veterans. And I want to thank Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I would like to yield 2 minutes to a very active member and Marine on the committee and a Marine veteran, Mike Bost of Illinois.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise today in support of H.R. 1381, the Burn Pit Registry Enhancement Act. As the ranking member said, I'm a Marine, and as a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, caring for those people who have served in our nation's veterans that have served, and protecting them is a top priority for me. They should have the peace of mind in knowing that they will be cared for by a grateful nation after having that time that they served. I've had veterans come into my office with health problems that they shouldn't be having. They're young. They don't have a family history, but sometimes they just can't pinpoint the cause. All too often, it can be from the use of burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's deeply frustrating that the VA does not have enough data to fully understand the effects of burn pits. We've seen this movie before. We saw it with Agent Orange. And then that Agent Orange also being exposed to the people that are serving offshore and the problem we've dealt with Blue Water Navy for our Vietnam veterans. They too face the consequences of unknown exposure and risk. We must do better. This bill seeks to do that. This is a step forward. It's not a fix-all, but at least we're trying to move in the direction that we need to move and not be trapped in the same situation we were with Agent Orange. To date, it's a bipartisan effort, and it puts our veterans first. And with that, I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased at this time to yield 3 minutes to my good friend and member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Cunningham.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in support of H.R. 1381, the Burn Pit Registry Enhancement Act. I want to thank my colleagues, Representatives Raul Ruiz and Brad Winstrup, for all their hard work on this bill and for their leadership as the co-sponsors of the bipartisan Burn Pits Caucus. As the members of this body are aware, one of the many perils our men and women in uniform face overseas is the threat of toxic exposure from burn pits. To dispose of their waste, service members in Iraq and Afghanistan tossed every variety of waste into massive pits to be set on fire, not knowing the harmful chemicals they were likely breathing in as a result. But even today, we still do not fully understand all of the risk associated with exposure to burn pits. That is why Congress established a voluntary registry for veterans who served in the vicinity of burn pits to document their experience and to learn more about ongoing studies. The data from this registry further enables doctors and the VA to better study the health impacts of burn pit exposure and to develop life-saving treatments. H.R. 1381 would strengthen this registry by allowing the families of deceased veterans to update the registry with the veteran's cause of death. And this added data will give medical researchers a more complete picture of the effects of toxic burn pits exposures and bring us closer to giving veterans the answers and the treatment that they deserve. As a member of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, I am pleased to support H.R. 1381, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass this common sense and pragmatic bipartisan bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 4 minutes to my good friend, Congressman Colonel Dr. Brad Winstrup, a former member of the committee and incredible veterans advocate, Brad Winstrup.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, former Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, Dr. Rell. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this bipartisan legislation that I've sponsored with Dr. Ruiz, the Burn Pit Registry Enhancement Act. And I'm pleased to have Dr. Ruiz's medical expertise engaged on this issue. Our nation's service members experience a variety of threats to their health and well-being, many of which extend well beyond combat. The theater of war can present many health challenges which do not show up until later in life. And we're learning that burn pit exposure can be one such condition. I occasionally smelled that type of smoke that can arise from burn pits when I served in Iraq. I support increased research into the range of health impacts that can arise from burn pit exposure. In order to effectively help our nation's veterans, we need an accurate registry of service members and veterans who were exposed to burn pits, as well as detailed records of health impacts from that exposure. Currently, the Airborne Hazards and Burn Pit Registry monitors the health records of veterans exposed to burn pits. This registry helps the VA identify health conditions possibly related to burn pit exposure or other airborne hazards that can arise during military service. It also keeps exposed veterans informed about studies and treatments and helps improve programs to help veterans who are concerned that they may have been exposed to toxic chemicals while they were deployed. The Burn Pit Registry Enhancement Act will allow a veteran's family member or other selected individual to update the burn pits registry with the veteran's cause of death. This will improve the reported data available for studies related to burn pits and help researchers examine the full range of diseases, health conditions, and outcomes that may result from exposure to burn pits. Dr. Ruiz did an excellent job when he spoke to many of those types of things that we need to be concerned about. We still have a lot to understand about the impacts of burn pit exposure, no doubt about it. And this is one small but important step towards that full understanding. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Reserve, balance my time.
Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm so pleased to see that we have 3 doctors that are either now or were associated with the Veterans Affairs Committee and that they have supported this legislation. I have no further speakers and I'm prepared to close. So I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Ruiz, who was a very active member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, and I really hated him to see him leave our committee. He was a tremendous asset to the committee, and as you can see, continues to be that asset. And I think one of the things, Mr. Speaker, that this registry does, it also shows us on the committee how important it is to get our Cerner electronic health record done so that an active duty military recruit can go in at 18 years of age and have a virtual lifetime record so that we will have a treasure trove of data there 30, 40 years later, as we're doing right now, trying to figure out what to do with Agent Orange. If we do this correctly, we'll be able to not make these mistakes in the future, or to be able to go ahead and rapidly go ahead and make these claims, adjudicate these claims so that the veterans are treated properly and get the medical care they needed. I strongly support this bill. I urge my colleagues to do this, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Tennessee yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I fully associate myself with the remarks of the ranking minority member of the committee. Again, I want to express my gratitude to the professionally trained physicians who've weighed in on this legislation. I also, in further commenting about the importance of the electronic health records and the important oversight that was begun in the last Congress and which will continue in this Congress under my leadership, I agree. It is really important that we get those records to work properly and that the communication between the Department of Defense and the VA is functional. And I also think it's very important to make sure that we get those legacy records from the DoD wrapped into this whole package, because the service history and where our military service members have served, what they were exposed to, will provide a very important piece of information that will help us understand how toxic exposures have affected our veterans. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in passing H.R. 1381, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1381? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays. Until you ask us to vote. Yeah.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous